So Linus said some dumb shit, so I'm making this video that I can correct him because Linus, you're wrong. Sorry. So let's start.
Which is that the USB Implementers Forum is changing the branding again. I just want to give a shout out to GD Felt over on the forum, longtime member, first time poster. I actually don't know if you're a longtime member. First post on the forum in 2019. Okay, so why don't we go through some of what has led up to this moment. In 2019,
not a long-time member,
the USB IF implemented the following name changes. They took USB 3.0, which...
And that's a mistake. 3.0 is a specification. A marketing name is USB Super Speed. This is from 2008. It's based on specification, but the Super Speed USB is the marketing name, right? The logo guidelines. This includes like all of the time wireless USB. Man, that was a failure. But yes, it was for marketing always Super Speed USB. It comes from the fact that they originally marketed as USB and then high speed, so now it's super speed, and that's how it went. But let's go on.
Which was pretty self-explanatory.
Pretty straightforward. You get it.
I don't think USB 3.0 is self-explanatory much. If you're following tech, maybe, sure. If you're following the specification numbers, but super speed and high speed, well, I mean, they're not very explanatory either, but that's what the marketing was originally.
It's the first one. It's USB 3.
You had your USB 1 and 1.1. Okay, that
you didn't. 1.1 defined two speeds: low speed and high speed. Low speed at 1.5. Oh, not low speed and high speed. Low speed and full speed at 1 and 12 megabit. I'm looking at 2.0, by the way, because 1 and 1.1 do not exist anymore. They are being merged to 2.0. More about that later.
That was the slow one. Then you had your USB 2, okay? That was...
And it wasn't USB 2 specification, sure, but it was high speed at 480 megabit. See also low speed and full speed. It defines USB 2.0 specification defines three speeds: low speed, full speed, and high speed. Marketing names not great, but that's what they are. It's 2.0 can be at 1.5 megabit. It's low, but it's still 2.0 because it has been implemented following USB 2.0 specification.
The fast one. Then you had your USB 3. That was the faster.
And not USB 3. Because, again, marketing name, it's Super Speed USB. 3.0 was just the specification number.
One. Okay? Easy.
Good. Yep.
Okay. They renamed USB 3.0,
which was good,
to USB 3.1 Gen 1.
which is...
They didn't rename, they released USB 3.1 specification, and the USB 3.1 specification has two electrical levels: Gen 1, Generation 1 signaling, and Generation 2 signaling. Generation 1 is what was marketed as Super Speed USB, and it was 5 gigabit per second, and Generation 2 signal per lane, and Generation 2 signaling is 10 gigabits per second per lane. About lanes will be important later. And it was marketed as Super Speed USB and Super Speed USB 10 gigabit. That's it. The plus, it's interesting, the plus is in the logo, but it's not mentioned in the text. In general, like USB guidelines usually are about logos, because they are easier to trademark in part, but not about the text. And that's important because all the bullshit that manufacturers made was in a large part because they could create a bit of confusion that benefited them. And USB with USB 4, USB IF market trademarked the wordmark USB 4. But about that later.
They renamed USB 3.1, which was I don't even remember now. Was that the one that was like 10 gigabit?
I don't remember what.
It doesn't have a speed, as I said. It has two signaling generations, Gen 1 and Gen 2, but 3.1 can be 5 gigabit and 10 gigabit. Yes, about 10 gigabit is the maximum speed you could achieve in 3.1.
The differentiation.
I don't
is.
remember anymore. But that got renamed to USB 3.1 Gen 2. Then later, it was actually renamed to 3.2 Gen 2. And then USB 3.2 got renamed to USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2.
And that's very wrong. Very, very confusing statements. 3.1 Gen 1, it's equivalent to 3.2 Gen 1. But there is some small clarification and specification. 3.2 is specification. This is 3.1 specification, USB 3.1 specification, right? Specification got updated with errata and so on. But the signaling, the marketing is 20 gigabit or the Gen 2 by 2. 3.2, the main thing that it introduced is duplex operation because, as I said, Gen 1 signaling is 5 gigabit per lane and Gen 2 signaling is 10 gigabit per lane. That's important. The old USB-A connectors, they only had one lane, two differential pairs, one receive and one transmit. USB-C, which USB 3.2 came out to recognize, USB-C has two lanes, can support two lanes. It can support two transmit and two receive lanes, and as such can support dual lane operation, which is what USB 3.2 introduced, and that is how the speed increased, and that's why it is Gen 2 by 2. It's similar to PCI Express, Gen 3 by 16, Gen 3 by 8, and so on. It's the same concept, but super speed 20 gigabits was the marketing name, and that's how it should be called in all marketing materials. Motherboard manufacturers didn't. I haven't seen this logo used by motherboard manufacturers. I believe in part because logo usage guidelines, to use the logo you need to be an USB IF member. I don't think many motherboard manufacturers are USB IF members and do not certify their motherboards with USB IF, which is crazy, but that is how it is. What implements USB is usually like Intel and AMD. Motherboard manufacturers only just route the signals and don't bother certifying their motherboards, which is just reckless of them, I think. But they cannot use these logos, so they come up with their own bullshit, which is confusing. They come up with things that technically come from the spec, but aren't meant and never were meant to be exposed to consumers.
The group sought to make things easier for consumers by recommending to vendors that they label products not by their specification name, but by super speed USB followed by the max speed.
Which,
yeah, they do, but are not originally super speed USB, not with 10 gigabit, but when with 20 gigabit, that suggestion came, right? You see the 5 gigabit that it is mentioned previously wasn't.
in my opinion,
Not
pretty
bad.
okay.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Okay. So for example, with that guidance, USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2 would become super speed USB 20 gigabit per second.
Never was USB Gen 2 by 2 from marketing perspective according to USB IF. Motherboard manufacturers did their bullshit, and that's why it was known as that. But if they have listened to USB IF, it would have been USB super speed 20 gigabit, just as Linus says that. And they assume that he means that's good.
Okay, so now the USB IF is recommending that vendors just drop the super speed. So USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2 super speed USB 20 gigabit per second.
No need to mock this now. It never was USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2 super speed 20 gigabit. You're just mashing the names together for comedic effect. Please stop.
Is now USB 20 gigabit per second. I like it.
Me too. it's good.
That's actually fine.
That's-
I didn't actually know the conclusion of this when we got into it.
You know what's really great about it?
That's
The
okay.
best thing about it is that that's what I've been doing for years.
Yeah. Because
Instead
no one said
In fairness, he has been mostly, not always, I think, but mostly he has been doing that, which is good.
is super speed USB.
Instead of trying to do any of this, like you guys will watch me, and I don't always do it because it wasn't a formal naming convention. It was just something that I did because
It was partially a formal naming convention. It was super speed plus gigabits. This is from 2019, but this is 2014 super speed 10 gigabit. I have seen so many times this being called USB 3.2 Gen 2 or USB 3.1 Gen 2, which it never should have been called that way. It should have been called super speed USB 10 gigabit. That's it.
it was the only thing that could possibly make sense of this for me. Is I'll be holding up a laptop, or I'll be looking at the back IO of a motherboard, and I'll be like, yeah, it's got 4 USB 10 gigabit ports. Because that's the only
Fucking motherboard manufacturers misrepresenting, just not reading USB marketing guidelines, or not just doing it to create confusion so they could sell motherboards that are worse, sell old stock. That makes me angry.
thing anyone cared about
Yeah.
was how fast does it go.
Yeah.
I don't care by how many things of
super
what
speed, whatever.
gen thing it is.
I did like the logo setups that they had for it.
Logos are nice, yes. These logos are pretty nice. These are more for next to the parts, and instead these ones are for packaging more or online materials. But yes, these parts are cool. These workable, I guess, but they are consistent. So at least that.
That's a weird curveball that I'll throw out there.
Okay.
I didn't mind that.
So they have good graphic designers and bad product naming people.
Motherboard manufacturers have bad product marketeers because they are the ones who came up or just didn't look into or just took what the engineers said, because engineers do in engineering it makes sense calling it Gen 1 Gen 2, but in marketing it doesn't. But marketeers just likely put it in whatever they heard from engineers. One option or other option, they were specifically trying to make confusion, neither of which are good.
Now, where things are going to get a little bit complicated here is that USB has gotten a lot more, well, complicated. So we're dropping super speed, but what we don't know yet is how things like USB 4 play into all of this now that we're dropping the USB 4 branding, because
So, fun stuff. USB 4 doesn't have USB branding. USB 4 branding doesn't have USB 4 in it. That's USB 4 performance packaging logos. They don't have USB 4. Simply. There is USB 4 wordmark, but there's no USB 4 in the logos. It is just USB 4 40 gigabits and USB 4 20 gigabits. ODTM on USB 4, that's important because this wordmark is what is preventing motherboard manufacturers to do the same bullshit with USB 3.2 that they did with USB 3.2. I believe that is purely the reason why USB trademarked USB 4. Because, well, technically USB 4 specification does have Gen 2 and Gen 3 speeds, signaling speeds. Like 20 gigabit is Gen 2 by 2, and 40 gigabit is Gen 3 by 2. But happily, vendors cannot use those names because it's wordmarked, and USB IF will just go for you if you use those names simply, because it should be just 40 gigabits and 20 gigabits. Continue.
USB 4 is not really just a new generation of USB. It also has the ability to carry a PCI Express signal, which is super different. That's how you...
Not quite. Not quite just that. USB 4 is super different by itself. USB 4 it really is very different from USB 3.2. The original name in the prototypes was CIO, Converged IO. It really is different, and it is different because it is purely a tunneling protocol. It defines how to tunnel other protocols within its own framing, like PCIe, DisplayPort, and this might be a bit new for some, USB 3.2. It does not have a data transfer protocol like USB 3.2 and 2.0 have. It purely says how to tunnel other protocols in it, like PCIe and DisplayPort and USB 3.2. So with USB 4, you are moving USB 3.2 data through it. You can't even exceed 20 gigabit with for USB 3.2 data over USB 4 because of USB 3.2 limitations. PCI Express is for USB 4 is signaled exactly the same as DisplayPort or USB 3.2. So it isn't that different.
You can connect things like external graphics cards over a USB Type-C cable. So we're going to have to get a little bit further into this.
Someone said that the logos have come out and they're similar and they're good. So
okay. Cool. Another thing that we're not really addressing here is USB gets used for more than just connecting your digital camera to your computer these days. We charge our devices, sometimes at extremely, extremely high power, like charging rates, with these USB cables. And so it's a lot more than just what data rates a cable can handle. It's also what gauge the wires inside it are that determines how much power that cable can actually carry. So
that's true. And there are logos for that. Here, cable logos. This is just for power, and this is power and speeds. This is packaging. This is what you should put on a cable if you're a good manufacturer. They are good. Very understandable.
Let's go on here. USB 4 version 1.0, so that's what we would know as USB 4 right now. USB version 2, so I guess that would be USB 2. USB 3.2, SuperSpeed Plus, Enhanced SuperSpeed, and SuperSpeed with a plus sign instead of a word plus, are defined in the USB specifications. However, these terms are not intended to be used in product names, messaging, packaging, or any other consumer-facing content.
That's a lot of stuff that he said, and some of it is very confusing. There are several specifications. Currently, living specifications are USB 2.0, USB 3.2 revision 1.1, and USB 4. USB 2.0 also has like 15 errata documents, which is fun. Then there into 3.1, 3.2 and USB 4, there is errata merged into them. And you may know that there is no 1.1 or 3.0 or 3.1 specification that are still like alive. They have been superseded, as I said with 2.0, yeah? They have been superseded by other specifications. In this case, the USB 1.0 and 1.1 have been superseded fully by USB 2.0. USB 3.0 and 3.1 have been superseded fully by 3.2 specification. And soon USB 4 specification version 1.0 will be superseded by USB 4 specification version 2.0. That's that. And it's important to know that USB IF wants you to implement the latest version of each specification because it contains important edits that will improve reliability. So I can implement a USB 2.0 device that only talks at low speed operation, that 1.5 megabit, but still call it 2.0, even though the speed has been originally defined in 1.0. Specification numbers shouldn't be taken as speeds because specifications define more than one speed, all of them. 2.0 defines low speed, full speed, and high speed. Confusing, I know. Like this is low speed is 1.5, full speed is 1.2 to 12 megabit, and high speed is 480 megabit. But they are living in a single specification. Similarly, 3.2 defines two signaling speeds and also ability for duplex. So essentially, you can from 3.2 implementation, you can expect anywhere from 5 to 10 to 20 gigabit per second speeds. USB 4.0 also defines two speeds. It defines a speed of 20 gigabit when using Gen 2 signaling and 2 lanes, and 40 gigabit when using Gen 3 signaling and 2 lanes. And when talking about the boards, in 3.2 specification, there is Gen 1 and Gen 2 physical layers, right? And Super Speed and Super Speed Plus as a word, protocols. There's a few minor differences between Super Speed and Super Speed Plus. Enhanced Super Speed, as written in the spec, is used as and I quote this, as a generic adjective referring to any valid collection of USB-defined features that were defined for the bus that runs in parallel to the USB 2.0 bus in a USB 3.2 system. That's also worth noting. USB 2.0 is running within the newer USB standards unchanged, basically, to help with legacy compatibility. Like USB 3.2 is a very, very separate thing from USB 2.0, even though both are included in the same connector. It's confusing, I know. Also, Super Speed and Super Speed Plus, with a plus sign, have been used in marketing. But after this change, they will no longer be used in marketing.
This is from Source 2. This is from Ars Technica. This was updated in September. They still recommend that vendors label USB 2 as high-speed USB with no performance indicator.
As I said, high speed is more correct because 2.0 can be 1.5 megabits, and that's only useful basically for keyboard and mice nowadays. Everything else should be high speed, or at least full speed. But dear God, not low speed. And the marketing should reflect that. No need to sigh, Linus.
Most products using USB 2 spec are peripherals like keyboards and printers, so they don't think consumers will mistake the tech for being faster than, say, USB 5 gigabit per second. Okay. The USB IF also feared people confusing USB 480 megabit per second as being faster than USB 5 gigabit per second due to the larger number. That's fair enough. So why don't we just call it USB 2, because that's what we've been...
That you haven't been calling
it since like 2003 or whatever.
You haven't been? Nerds have been calling it, but in marketing, it has been high-speed USB. USB 2.0 was, I'm like certain that USB 2.0 as the marketing term has been mainly purged by people who are not USB IF members, so they can just ignore certification and just push USB 2.0. Because using these logos requires certification. This is from 2008, but there are older versions that of like this presentation, these guidelines that I couldn't have been bothered to dig up. But it has always been marketed as high speed, right? Basic speed for the lower 12 and the 1.5 megabit, because basic speed is really useless for a flash drive, for example, right now. But high speed for a flash drive, it's still fine. It's important for it to still be marketed as high speed, not as 2.0. Because, as I said earlier, this 2.0 I can implement 1.5 megabit, and it's not false marketing because I implemented it following the USB 2.0 specification. No.
That would be fine, but okay, fine, sure. For USB-C cables, they now recommend packaging and logos that show both maximum data transfer rate and power delivery. That's excellent.
But it indeed is. These are great. These are very nice. And please add them to your cables manufacturers. I want them, please. Also, you'll know that there is no longer a 100 watt cable, because 100 watt cables have been deprecated due to EPR, extended power range power delivery, and they just decided that 100 watts was a useless differentiator because it's not that much expensive to go just straight for 240 watts. All right, so continue.
It's actually really good. I'm down with that.
But the USB-IX guidelines do not specify other capabilities like Intel Thunderbolt support, whether a cable is active or passive, or if it allows PCIe tunneling, which is, in my opinion, the most differentiating thing about USB 4.
So there's a bit to unpack here. Thunderbolt support is twofold. Thunderbolt 4 is simply USB 4 with all the optional features, and basically any USB 4 cable will support anything that Thunderbolt 4 supports. Thunderbolt 3, however, is a bit of a different story. It has a completely different electrical layer to USB 3.2, and well, passive cables will work with both if the length is short enough, but active cables need to support the signaling mode. And active cables for USB 3.2 don't support USB 4 and usually don't support Thunderbolt 3. Active cables for Thunderbolt 3, however, often didn't support USB 3.2 either. Very interesting, until Apple came up with one, which is kind of a big deal at the time. People didn't think that a cable could be done that supports both economically. But worth noting that active cables for USB 4 must support USB 3.2 and Thunderbolt 3 signaling. So USB 4 cables must work with anything, basically. And also, interesting note, optically isolated cables only with USB 3.2, which is interesting. Why there aren't specifications for optically isolated USB 4 cables. Now, that's about the active cables, basically. The active cables really shouldn't matter. In the spec, short active cables supporting length to 5 meters shall work in both directions and orientations and should function like passive cables from the user's perspective. And they most often do. Like, passive cables beyond a meter for USB 4 don't exist. Simply. Anything for USB 4 beyond a meter is an active cable, and they support everything. Now, with PCIe tunneling, as I said, PCIe is tunneled with the USB 4 data. It is tunneled the same way. Every cable supports PCIe tunneling. 0 exceptions. All of them support PCIe tunneling. All USB 4 cables support PCIe tunneling. I don't know how to say this hard enough because Linus seems to be confused. And I understand where the confusion can come from. In USB 3.2 days, the cables couldn't go into Thunderbolt alternate mode, which, well, was required for PCI Express tunneling. But with USB 4, there is no separate alternate mode for PCI Express tunneling, and USB 4 itself removes a lot of needs for alternate modes, like for DisplayPort alternate mode, and that means that every cable must support PCI Express tunneling in Thunderbolt and DisplayPort tunneling. It should work fine. And now the confusion that Thunderbolt 3 created will be gone, because genuinely this is something that Thunderbolt 3 created, in my opinion. Thunderbolt 3 added these new cables that only support PCI Express, basically only support PCI Express tunneling, because Thunderbolt was a really strange. Thunderbolt hubs basically implemented 3.2 hosts over PCI Express. Thunderbolt didn't send any USB 3.2 data. They only sent PCI Express data. Now that PCI Express data is being sent over USB 4, it can be, and USB 4 also can send USB 3.2 data simultaneously. The hubs should get maybe a bit cheaper because they don't need to implement their own hosts.
According to USB-IF president and COO, consumer study groups showed that most consumers only care about the highest data performance level a product can achieve or the highest power level. But that is fucking stupid.
Have you made a consumer study?
No offense. Because PCI Express tunneling is something that the average consumer wouldn't understand to tell you that they care about.
No, because as I said, PCI tunneling is included with USB 4, no exceptions, no matter with the cable. There are exceptions, sorry. PCI Express capabilities are optional for the hosts. Your computer or phone, for that matter, may decide to not implement PCI tunneling while implementing USB 4. It's purely depending on the computer that is providing the USB 4 port. Hubs must route the PCI Express signals, must implement the PCI Express switch. The devices don't, because well, the devices may not need PCI Express. But basically what I'm saying is it doesn't matter for the cables or for the hubs whether they must support PCI Express tunneling, and only the host defines whether PCI Express tunneling is available or not. Linus, no. The speed and power is everything that defines the cable.
That's your entire job, is creating branding and messaging that helps people understand the value of it. And just because you've been doing this speed-based marketing and branding for so long and people understand it well and tell you that they want to know about it doesn't mean that there aren't other important aspects of the specification that must be communicated.
Well, what are the other aspects? As I said, PCI Express is included. Thunderbolt is included. There isn't like anything that, at least for the cables, can be differentiated. There are no other aspects.
Dumb.
Not.
And the USB-IF never talked to us again.
It should, just to clear up your misconceptions, because my God, you have a lot of them.
Man,
Have they talked to you at all?
I don't know.
Yeah.
They haven't, clearly, because you have been eating manufacturer garbage marketing. Simply said, because all of your misconceptions are shaped by manufacturers just not listening to USB-IF.
I mean, I had already talked about this. We've been working on cables in the background for a little while. And I had already said, yeah, we're just going to completely ignore whatever the USB-IF said.
You shouldn't, because for one, USB-IF creates the specification, but
We're just going to put the maximum data rate that it can handle and the maximum power it can handle. So essentially, they've just
They're doing that.
done
Which is
that,
good.
which is great.
It is. But also you should certify your cables with USB-IF. If you don't do this, you're no better than random no-name manufacturers who don't certify the cables at all. And it's really bad in that way. That like a lot of most of the cables aren't certified. It's a bit of a curse because USB is an open standard. But it's also great that USB is an open standard because I can just open up the standard and read it. All of the 410 pages. It's annoying, but if you do, please fucking certify your cables. For the love of God. Certifications are good. Don't miss out on them.
Really good.
Yeah, that's a step in the right direction.
Good job. Yeah. I think that's about it.
We're also going to put whether it supports PCIe tunneling, though.
Checkbox that is always ticked isn't that useful, Linus? As I said, it will also always be ticked if you're doing USB 4 cables, which you should. Anything else isn't useful right now. They're the best cables.
Because that's
Of course.
really important.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to make USB cables less confusing.
They aren't that confusing. Thunderbolt made it a mess, yes, but for what it's worth, it is. Oh, there is a bunch of logos. I do agree. They could be a bit more simplified, but if these logos were fucking printed on the cables, it would be so much easier to understand for the average consumer. It's annoying that it is how it is, but by God, these are the logos that you should use, please. So I think that's everything that I wanted to say about this. I hate how manufacturers just completely ignored USB-IF's marketing guidelines and just went with their own bullshit. Like, you open up a random motherboard this description website, and there's zero like these logos. None of these, like, I haven't seen these logos on motherboard manufacturers' websites at all, even though that's what they are implementing. And I believe they didn't place these logos because they didn't even check if these exist, or B, just wanted to create confusion, or didn't certify their motherboards with USB-IF and just couldn't use them. Really annoying. But I hope that USB-IF with USB 4 will, the fact that they have a word mark, I hope that bullshit is well behind us. So that's that.